Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Never Drop Your Sword podcast, where I get to talk to all kinds of artists and creatives and walk through their journey of being courageous in their art. We want to encourage you and inspire you with the painters, musicians, seamstresses, authors, filmmakers that we interview on this podcast to give you courage and hope in your endeavors and also just in your life. And today I have a special guest, which all of my guests are very special, but Alexandra Wendt, author and living in Italy now, is married and has a family there. She has a very exciting book coming out. And the reason why I say exciting is because it's based off a lot of history, which if you listen to this channel at all or you're part of the 1232 audio epic, then you know I'm all about the history, medieval, Renaissance, you name it. If it's pre 1945, I'm in love with it. So let's get into this. Alexandra Wendt, welcome to the show. Please tell my listeners who you are and what you do and where you are.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so as you said, I'm a writer. I'm living in northern Italy. I've been here since I got my master's in art history, actually. I met my husband in Florence where I did that. And yeah, now we have a little baby. He's 15 months now, which is an exciting age, also challenging. And now, along with writing, I also work in the marketing department of a company that helps people get Italian citizenship. And so I also get to write for them, which is awesome. I get to write full time, which is something I never thought I'd get to say.
That's awesome. Yes, that's wonderful. And you're also a follower of Christ. And I can't wait to talk with that about you too, because like you just said, you never thought you'd be able to really write for a living. You've obviously pursued a lot of creative things, even in your higher education. And we never know what God's timing is going to be because we have our desires and wants and needs, and he knows all of those intimate things. He promises our needs to be met, and we just don't know his timing. I was just talking to another author who, finally got to buy a home in Wales where she writes about all the time, and it's been an 18-year-long journey for her. And they just bought a home in Wales. And, the Lord brings things around and he redeems so much of the time we spend working and educating ourselves and working towards our purposes. And we might have some kind of crappy job, or I know you taught English for a while, and things that you think like, man, this has nothing to do with what I really want to do. And yet here you are.
It's so true. Yeah. I mean, life just takes such unexpected turns. And I mean, I could imagine being in high school and thinking, oh, this is for sure the direction my life is going to take. And it's just 110% different now.
Awesome. That's cool. I like hearing that. I love hearing about that change. But let's also talk about your book. So you are working with Storyweaver Publishing,
Yes.
and they have signed on your book of Constellations and Clockwork. Now, all Stephen had to say was, this is inspired by Italian Renaissance and history, and I know you're really into that. And I was like, yes. So that's all he said to me. And I was like, I am in. So let's talk about your book just a little bit. And I know we can't give anything away, but we want to let people know why. Honestly, I don't come across too much fantasy, like maybe some historical fiction, but fantasy based in this absolutely colorful, intriguing, delightful period of history. Now, the Renaissance covers a couple of different centuries. Which century is this mostly inspired from?
It's mostly the mid to late 15th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. And I also, let's talk about some other books that people might have read that are kind of set in this era. We have Count of Monte Cristo. What else? What other kind of books would you, what other kind of books would you kind of throw into of Constellations and Clockwork?
Oh, so there's also The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco.
Mm-hmm.
That's more medieval. But it is kind of like a similar, historical basis. There's like a murder mystery going on and everything. There's that. I don't know why I'm thinking of the Mists of Avalon. I'm not thinking of all this medieval stuff. The Mists of Avalon too. More Arthurian legend though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
There
that would
honest
be go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying there honestly aren't a ton of examples out there that I can think of at least.
And the other thing, the reason why I think you're, and you would know this better than I, mentioning these Arthurian legends, because there was such a revival of Arthurian legend in the Renaissance era, especially when we're talking about a lot of the artwork, a lot of some of the styles of clothing were they were very drawn towards, and they really truly are in part responsible for the romanticizing of a lot of the Arthurian legend in that time period from the art that I've seen. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say so. There's definitely a lot of dialogue that goes on, I think, between literature and art, and a lot of it is unexplored in scholarship, which is unfortunate because I think it's a really fascinating subject.
Agreed, definitely. So this book here, this is going to be your debut novel.
That's right.
Excellent. Nice. Congratulations. So we've got enemies to lovers. We've got found family. You just mentioned a little bit of crime and heists, and we have alchemy. We have a lot of topics and discussions that we kind of know from history and paintings of the era in your book. How are you going to, or how have you kind of balanced bringing in the inspirations of Italian Renaissance to color your fantasy world? Like, is this kind of alternate history fantasy, or is it a whole new world, but you're going to feel at home because of these kinds of words, phrases, and descriptions of a more Italian Renaissance looking world?
So it is a whole different world, but it was pretty heavily inspired by the Renaissance. How heavily inspired depends on who asks me. If any of my former professors ask me,
Yeah.
not very much. So I did dig into a lot of my old research as well as new research, like clothing of the era. I really didn't know that much about, and I found it surprisingly difficult to research. Also, my two main characters, one is a clockmaker, the other's an architect. I didn't know anything about those professions, especially during the Renaissance. And so it has been challenging to do the research, but since it's fantasy, I can also make things up if I don't know or if I don't like something I find, which is nice.
Exactly. That is such a joy of being a sub creator, is the fact that we can take things of history and of the past, and we can get the opportunity to sprinkle in and manipulate and twist around. And I think that that is what makes fantasy so much fun to write and also enjoyable for others, because you're getting to add so much of your own imagination, and it's not just straight up historical fiction or something like that. So that's exciting. And let's talk about, you have on here that it's new adult. Now, what is that? Because in my experience, there's so much back and forth on exactly what that title means for a fantasy novel. So let's take your take when you're talking about Of Constellation and Clockwork. We've got fantasy, new adult, and inspired by the Italian Renaissance. How would you describe new adult?
Right. New adult, I think, is a very tricky genre. And I know people tried to make it take off a number of years ago and it kind of didn't. But I'm happy to still see people labeling their books new adult because I think there's very much a need for it in the market. I do think a lot of these kind of post college graduate, mid to late 20s people, they're still reading, they still want books. And most of them, I think, turn to young adult, which is fine. I love young adult too. So yeah, so that's my brief defense of new adult. But what it is, in the case of my book at least, I have characters who are all in the range of mid 20s to even like 32. I have a couple characters in their early 30s. But a lot of the themes they're dealing with are very much this kind of like, oh, I'm in this transitional period between being a teenager under my parents and officially establishing my own life, whether that's a family, a career. And so they're kind of navigating this world without without authority figures over them, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly. And I like young adult too, but I feel like it's trying to be way too encompassing of a genre because it has gained such popularity. We want those coming of age stories in like we as in just kind of the population at large. We want those coming of age stories. We want the kind of fantastical, maybe a little bit of the romance, but we are neglecting how much growth and coming of age happens in your 20s and into your 30s, and how that's even, especially your early 20s, just as informative and so many trials. It's definitely a new phase of teenagerhood almost, for many of us. And I think that we do need to have the new adult genre not as something that's going to be more risque, but something that is another part of the maturing journey.
Yes.
And I was really excited to see that you did put new adult on there, and good on you, because I think there's so many more stories that are in that place or want to be in that place, but because the market is, trying to goad everyone this way, it's inauthentic.
Yeah.
We have very adult situations for young adult novels. And I'm just like, wait a minute. We don't have to do that, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I agree that young adult is trying a little bit too hard to cover too much. It's fine exactly where it is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, can you give away, like, is there any historical figures that make appearances in your novel? Do we lean on, some Galileo or Da Vinci? Do we bring in any of those characters or their works into the story?
Oh, so I can say that there's well, I so at the time of recording this, I'm doing developmental edits, so this could change,
Sure.
fair warning. But there is an invention of Leonardo da Vinci's that I bring into the novel. Obviously not crediting him because he's
Yeah.
not in the world, but yeah, there's that. And more loosely, one of my characters is actually named after my favorite saint, Saint Catherine of Siena.
Ooh, St. Catherine of Siena. Let's talk about that. Um,
Yeah.
yes, please. For my listeners, which are a cross between, we've got a wonderful people from Legend Haven, which is a Catholic writers group and community, and then we've got a bunch of other various non-denominational and Protestant listeners on this show. And so, for those that may not know, talk about her a little bit. Give us why you wanted to name a character.
So actually, she was the subject of my master's capstone thesis. I wrote on the artist Giovanni di Paolo, who was also like early mid 15th century, his painted panels on her life that were kind of used to, or at least I argue, that were kind of used to establish her case for citizenship, sainthood.
That's me. That's good.
Yeah. And so she's such a fascinating figure. She was born in Siena in the early 14th century. And she wanted to become a nun, but her parents wanted her to marry. And so she cut off her hair so she wouldn't marry. She ended up joining the Third Order Dominicans. So they're like a lay version of a religious group. And she had all of these mystical experiences. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, there were recorded instances of her like levitating even, or being unable to be revived during prayer. And she was very inspirational in how she helped the poor and like her patients. She would go to the hospital in Siena and take care of people there. And she was arguably instrumental also in bringing the papacy from Avignon back to Rome, because she was
Mm.
writing the Pope a lot there and trying to convince him to get back to Rome. And so she was just super active her entire life, but at the same time didn't move around just a whole lot. I mean, she did make it all the way down to Rome, but yeah, in terms of like where she actually went and how she lived her life, it was overall fairly quiet and relatable, I think, which is
Mm.
inspiring.
And we neglect those sort of stories. We go after, you know, which I love Joan of Arc, but we go after these very large, boisterous, historical figures, saints, missionaries, varying spiritual and historical figures that, really disrupted the timeline. And we forget how many faithful people there were along the way
Yeah.
that are just as inspiring, and went through just as many like crazy mystical and miraculous things, but their lives were, not expanded or off into legend as some of these other figures are. And yet those individuals, those incredible people, can be so much more important because, like you just said, that's relatable that she had that consistent, she had made her stand, on what she wanted to do in life, but she was consistent, and she has that kind of, uh, yeah, simple, obviously very courageous and forward, but just live life. And you know
Yeah, absolutely. Those stories are so inspiring because it's the most relatable to us these days.
exactly, I think that's another reason why, podcasts and having longer format conversations are taking off, because we're just hearing from other people. We're not just hearing from celebrities and all these people that are supposed to be important. It'll be some random conversation with somebody you've never even heard of, and you'll find so much edification out of that. So it's lovely to look back on those people in history too. So I really love being able to talk about that a little bit. How has it been living in Italy and writing this story? Is it very, like, just, is it impossible just not to write about uh, Italy and just the whole inspiration because you're in it? Like, has it been very, uh, I don't know, what do you think? More challenging or less challenging to be in the environment that you're inspired by?
Oh, I think it definitely comes naturally. When I first came here for my study abroad in college, I was working on a totally different novel that was set in Scotland, actually, that I'm still quite fond of, though it's been shelved now for many years. But when I was here, I just immediately had the idea for some other fantasy story set in Italy. That one's also been shelved, but still, it is a very inspiring place. And I actually wrote the first draft of this I'm not in Florence anymore, but I was in Florence at the time and living around the Santo Spirito district in the Il Carano, which is just, filled old buildings, old churches. So I could just walk down the street and get inspired for the setting of my book and everything.
Mhm. Mhm.
Natural, honestly.
Oh, I believe that. I believe that. And yes, you've mentioned a couple of things. You've mentioned, Mists of Avalon, you've mentioned some Arthurian legends and stuff like that. You obviously have a passion for that too. In what way would you consider this novel? How do those worlds connect? What part of Mists of Avalon would your story kind of connect to?
Well, now I've read it. I read it many, many years ago, so I can't remember it precisely. But I think just in a very general way, the kind of enchantment around it. Because even though my world, there is like the magic system is very scientific, more technical. And of course, as I said, I have a clockmaker and an architect. So on the surface, it's not a very like magical story, but there are kind of moments in it and elements and certain symbols I bring in for this more mystical aspect to it. And that's kind of what made me think of Mists of Avalon was this almost kind of dreamlike landscape.
Very well put. That's exciting because I think that's a huge draw to Miss of Avalon is it is very, you're very swept away into this it's very tangible, textured sort of fantasy realm. So that's exciting. I think that's a fun comparison in that way. So that's the other thing too is I haven't come across this too much until I recently moved to the South in Tennessee. And I get asked this question now, which thankfully I haven't really had to deal with out west, is, how do you reconcile your faith with fantasy? How can you write about magic? What does that have to do with Jesus and your life in that? So I have plenty of answers for that. How do you answer that question? Do you get that from anybody? I mean, thankfully, being involved in Catholicism, there's so much more freedom for the mystic. But, you know, getting out there in the world, do people ask you that question? How do you write magic and fantasy and be a follower of Christ?
So I actually haven't been asked that myself, but it's funny you brought that up because I struggled with that a lot right before this book. This would be a side topic, more personal, but I was in the fall of 2020, I was really struggling with my faith. I had kind of a major crisis of faith that led to a lot of scrupulosity. I never lost it, but I yeah, I was scrupulous, which means, I'm worried about everything I do is a sin. Everything I do is wrong. I can't. Yeah, and there's kind of a longer story behind that, but that also led into my writing. And I thought at the time, well, oh, what if I write, characters who do bad things? Is that okay for me to do? Am I kind of implicitly encouraging that then? And even with the side of bringing in magic into the story, I was really concerned about that. And I finally just stopped myself. I was reaching the end of a draft of this other book I was working on. And I said, okay, let me just stop for a few months, just not write. And I worked more on my faith life and my prayer life. And I already had kind of an idea of, oh, this, clock punk fantasy I want to write set in a world based on Renaissance Italy. But I just kind of let that simmer and put that to the side for a while. And then when I was in a little bit better place with my faith life, I decided to finally take down some notes on it and return to it and very much just let God guide me through that. And of course, I still pray that I'm pleasing him with my work, of course. Not saying that he was like doing all of this for me. But that is to say, I did have to go through this period of surrender that I think helped a lot. And I reached a good place of peace with it. And to me, it's all about how you approach the magic system. I know there are many different answers to this topic, and people have many different opinions. But for me personally, I don't feel comfortable writing anything occult or that deals with witchcraft. I feel more comfortable when my magic system does look more like technology, like electricity, something that's more accessible to the masses, which is very much how it's presented in my book. But yeah, but it is a difficult topic.
It is. And which I find it silly that it is because, in scripture we have chariots of fire and we have axe heads floating and we have dry bones coming to life and we have, of course, these things are all through the power of God and not through the power of man, but it is man's faithfulness that can charge the earth essentially and make room for the Lord to do these incredible things that we would call very magical today and miraculous. And I think, like what you said, that surrender and then making room for the Holy Spirit as you're writing. My sister and I's novel, 1232, is like a time travel medieval fantasy based in the 13th century. And so in medieval Wales, and we deal head on with like paganism and yeah, Avalon kind of stuff. And then a priest who is just speaking scripture and dealing with the miraculous and the magical in one book while having our two main characters walk through a journey of faith. And when you leave room, we always as an author we're so in control of so many things, we can manipulate and write and this and that, but it's amazing what can happen when you do surrender to the Lord and you invite him into your writing and what you're doing. And there's this whole other realm of a possibility that happens that taps into your writing, and it doesn't have to just be about God saying, oh, well, make sure you write this beautiful thing about faith or something. It can even just be an inspirational scene or great dialogue or tension. Like it's so cool when we invite God into our art. And I think that's why there are so many artists who find a type of spiritual satisfaction in creating because we are doing the very thing he designed us to do. And I hope I haven't put any words in your mouth in that way of
No, no.
opening opening up yourself to hear him while you're writing, even if it is writing a villain, wouldn't you say?
No, absolutely. And even when I was writing this book, and well, I still try to do it when I write, but I was very conscious during this book to begin every writing session in prayer, to just a few seconds, but just to pause and thank God that this was, something that he had given me, this great passion I had, and to ask that he be with me while I write. Because before I just didn't really think of God. It was kind of like, oh, I write, that's my thing. Then I'll pray to you and, give you your time some other time, basically.
Exactly, exactly. Now, what are some obstacles you've had to overcome in your writing journey?
Oh, I would say there was a period, but right before I wrote this book, where I guess I was writing, but I also wasn't really writing. I felt very kind of stunted in it. And I think that was in large part because I was in graduate school at the time. And then before that, I was doing a gap year back in Siena. And so life was just kind of busy. And for the first time in my life, there were more exciting things to be doing than writing. But also, I had been very active on the Twitter writing community, which was at one point a great place. And I made a lot of writing friends on there, critique partners I met.
Mhm.
But then there's something about the atmosphere that became very toxic to me. And just a lot of this seeing people's careers just get thrown away just so easily. And it made me terrified. It really scared me to write anything because I became so scared of offending someone or saying the wrong thing. And so then I just lost all inspiration. And I didn't really think about it that way at the time. It was something that I kind of connected a few years later. And I thought, oh, maybe that's why I haven't really felt like writing as much. And now I very much distanced myself from Twitter. I do still have an account on there that I check in on occasionally, but it might be different now. I guess it's called X, not Twitter. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, it might be different now, but I just don't engage there anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. hmm Do you find that social media drains your creativity or bolsters your creativity?
It depends. I definitely can find myself checking it too much when I should be doing other things, and so I try to kind of curb that and get control of that. But at the same time, I do still have a lot of close writing friends, most of whom I've met on Instagram now. And it's really inspiring to me to see their posts, see them get excited about something they're reading or a scene they're working on. Or I love when someone has a book coming out and they do like character intros with these beautiful reels that I could never create, but it's all very nice. So I think it depends on how you use it, at least for me.
Exactly. Social media should just be a tool and not, something that we live by and breathe and, treat it like a horoscope almost. A lot of people do, they open it up and however it makes them feel or whatever they see will influence their entire day or their next decision or their shopping decision. And it's almost become very horoscope-esque. People got to check it first thing, and then by the feeling of the world or their friends is how they make their next decisions. And we especially are prone to that as artists who are on it because we're just trying to get the word out. We're just, yeah, and trying to help our friends share with their friends, and then also be like, hey, here's something I made, and we have so much bombarding against us on that in so many ways. Do you think there is a spiritual conflict on social media?
Oh, so I've listened to one of my personal favorite people, Bishop Robert Barron, talk about this a lot on his Word on Fire podcast because he's a Catholic bishop and he very much has a social media presence. That's kind of
Mhm.
his way of evangelizing. And I like what he says on this subject about kind of like what you said too. There's a use for social media, but there's also a time when you need to set it down and kind of stay away from it. And so I think if you just keep its function in mind and don't go beyond that, don't, as you said, treat it like a horoscope. Especially now that I have a book coming out, I see it more and more as a marketing tool. Um, and a place, of course, to connect with fellow writers and readers. Whereas before, it could easily get too mixed up in my personal life, which for some people, that's fine. But for me, I feel more and more like putting this distance, keeping my personal life as my personal life and using social media more for that connection with writers and readers, I think.
Absolutely. And you talked about how, you were on Twitter or X or whatever, and you had a little bit of fear of being bold because you were seeing all these such a toxic community. Now, you wrote something on Substack about Taylor Swift. Obviously, the fear is gone because to mention, her in any kind of negative way, you were talking about, whining and kind of uh, her whole songwriting musical journey. Can you just sort of summarize that Substack for us? Because I want our listeners to go read your Substacks because I really enjoy checking those out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I should say first, I didn't intend to criticize her on that. I mean, maybe a little. No, I didn't really intend to. I was more criticizing myself and how I've used her music in the past. But yeah, the whole point of that post specifically was about finding growth in yourself. And like how I, as an angsty teenager, I loved her music and she was a very inspirational person to me. I still think she is, honestly. I really like her. But I could definitely listen to her music and, sit and cry in my bedroom and like journal when I was a teen, as teens are wont to do.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so she came out with her new album, The Tortured Poets Department, which is basically everything I was feeling as a teenager, dark, sad, you name it. And, I've been through the past couple of years, I've been through some difficult things with, my faith life, going through that, just the pain of like moving away from family and, things with friends. And so there was definitely a temptation for me to, oh, let me just drown my sorrows in this album and just kind of dwell in that. And I had to think about it a lot and pray about it and just think, God, of course, doesn't want us to ignore these feelings. He wants us to, it's okay to feel things. It's okay to recognize hurt and pain, but he also wants you to come out of it. He doesn't want you to sit and dwell in it. And I thought, at least for me, and honestly, reading a lot of what other people said about that album, it seemed like it gives more of a tendency for people to sit in their hurt rather than kind of working through it and moving on. Now, of course, I don't know everything that prompted her to write that album or where she's at with it. I hope it helped her and gave her the kind of catharsis and whatever she was going through. But it's a fine line, I think.
Agreed. And that's something that puzzles me about her career is while she's obviously an incredible performer, she's obviously very good at writing. I know too much about the music industry to attribute that to her being a good person. I truly hope that everyone who loves and believes in her is right, that she is a kind, wonderful, excellent role model for young girls and is very giving. I really hope that's the case. Being a part and seeing some of the true underbelly of the entertainment industry, I have my doubts. But, the big thing for me is that growth and that fruit, as we say. And that is kind of goes back to our earlier conversation about like young adult versus new adult is like, where are those stories of growth, the stories of maturity, of people who are older, who have similar problems to when you do when you're a teenager, but then there's new and different problems and new and different ways of solving them than you would if you were a teen or you know and we forget as artists to write about that, and I think that speaks a lot about our own personal maturity. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, everybody, you got to go check out her Substacks. You've got a bunch of very, very thoughtful, well, I guess they're not really called articles, are they? Which or blog posts, I suppose. But
I honestly still struggle with it. I've been calling them more like personal essays. I don't know.
there you go. Yeah, personal essays. Maybe that's it. So,
Yeah.
we've talked about, we've kind of ran the gambit here of of emotion and feeling and faith and writing. So, and you've mentioned, you've had as an interesting walk with the Lord, especially in recent years. You've been very productive by, pursuing higher education. You're married, you have a kiddo. There's a lot going on in your life, girl. And now you've got your debut novel. You're obviously a hard worker. So, Alexandra, what is the one thing that keeps you going?
Oh, that's tough, but I do have to say my husband, which sounds like an easy answer, I know, but
Suck it.
yeah. He's been with me now. I mean, I've had some of I think the hardest times of my life have been when I was with him, and I think he would say the same thing about his life too. We've just both of us have gone through, not like as a couple, but like both of us in our separate lives. We've gone through some really difficult things, but we've been there for each other throughout them. And so just knowing that he's by my side, I mean, he is just so good at, calming me down when I'm like freaking out because he is one of the calmest and most patient people I know. It's
Uh,
inspiring. But yeah, absolutely him.
Oh, I love that. That's great. We have got to continue to hold on to those victories and triumphs with our greatest friendships in life. And being married is definitely one of those. And being able to find someone who is a great friend like that is such a huge blessing. A lot of people are having a hard time finding a deep friendship like that for their spouse. And so that's lovely. I love hearing that. Say it more, say it all the time.
Yes.
I love it. I love it. So this is an interesting question, and I think we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, but let's see if we can get really succinct here. So, how do you reconcile the world's idea of creative success, as in, there's various expectations with your social media, with your release, with all of this sort of stuff, your own personal, and the world has a very specific idea of what a successful creative looks like, i.e., Taylor Swift. Just to bring her back in here for a little bit of fun. But how do you balance that with the reality that the kingdom of God works very differently?
It was learning to surrender my writing to the Lord, honestly. That was the big thing for me, and it's funny because initially when I had that realization of, "Oh, my writing's not my own. If I wanna continue this, I have to give it over to God." I was scared and I thought, "Well, this is gonna destroy my creativity. I have to write by, certain rules and
Mm.
standards and all of that." But it was amazing how it had the exact opposite effect. I felt such a release of pressure, probably because I no longer felt like I had to cater to, like, certain, market trends or what, people want nowadays, and, I mean, of course, we all have to pay attention to the market to some extent, but I did feel a lot freer than in my writing paradoxically, which was kind of funny.
Exactly. I love the way you put that because we do think when we give stuff over to the Lord, oh, here comes the hammer. He's going to say, get rid of this, get rid of that. Da, 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 da. And while that is true, what he really wants us to do is just this. And then he's like, like, wow, here you
Yeah.
go. This is the whole new world that you're not even thinking about in this. So I know a lot of really young authors who are wonderful young men and women who have wonderful styles in writing, very passionate. I know that they just heard what you said and said, but how? How do I surrender? What does that mean? What is the step? What is that even? Because we get told, what we should do as Christians, and sometimes it feels like nobody is telling us how. So, for that very specific person, what's step one to surrendering your creative self to the Lord?
So for me, it involved learning a lot more about my faith. Even though I was a cradle Catholic, I still felt like there was a lot of stuff I didn't know or didn't fully understand that I had to kind of grapple with. And I did feel very alone during that process because I didn't really have any friends who were Christian at the time. And so dealing with it alone was honestly awful. So I recommend to everyone to try to get Christian friends. But it involved first a lot of education on my part and just kind of learning, of course, as a Catholic, learning our more about our catechism and what our church teaches and all of that. And then kind of, as I said before, I had to sort of stop writing for a while. And pray a lot and just kind of work on healing myself and growing deeper in relationship with the Lord. I honestly, I mean, we talk about it a lot as Christians, but I can't emphasize prayer enough, that how fundamental it is for your relationship. Yeah, like it helped me so much. It still helps me because I still struggle sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My husband and I were just spending time with the Lord this morning, and I felt like while I spend a lot of time in prayer, I will often say, like, of course, Lord, I'm going to spend time with you, but I'll do it later, and put a lot of other things first. And goodness, what a difference that makes in your day and your morning to put him first, the Lord first, and to be able to have that prayer and time. And yes, sometimes he does ask you to put down those creative things for a while you
Yeah.
work on your relationship with him. There's nothing more important than that relationship with him. And because he is your friend, he's there to walk you through, hear your ideas, all those sort of things. But having a good fellowship is great. That's why I would definitely recommend you join Legend Haven. I'll send you some links. They're a fantastic group. I don't know if you've heard of them yet, of various Catholic writers from all over the world, where we get together. We have a conference in October, which you should definitely do because your book's coming out in October. We hope the fall,
Yeah.
and they would love to host you, and you could have a little book release with them. They'd love it. And then, of course, Realm Makers, which I know you've heard about through Story Weavers. It's a great place to tap into. So we're building communities of writers of faith, and I think that's beautiful. And we're going to take the entertainment industry back, I
Yes.
think.
I
We
hope
need
so.
to. We really need to. All right, girl, I have had so much fun talking to you. And, let's just reiterate here. So we have Of Constellations and Clockwork, released by Story Weaver Publishing, the book by Alexandra Wendt. That's you. Tell everyone where we can find you and kind of our target date for your book release.
Yeah, so the target release is, I think, October, or more broadly this fall 2024. You can find me mainly on Instagram under Wendt Writing. Um, Twitter, sort of under the same username, though I'm not very active on there. And
Right.
of course, my Substack is called Till We Find Joy, but the actual URL is my name, alexandrawent.substack.com.
Great. And we will have links to all of that in the show description, on the podcast, and on the YouTube channel. Everyone, please check that out. Mark your calendars for the fall, and hopefully we'll have some pre-order information for you. I can't wait to read this book, and I think that many of my listeners will be adding it to their TBR as well. So I just have one final question. This is the last one that I kind of ask at the end because I want to continue to open dialogue with other artists here and see their opinion. So can be interpreted as broad, but you're an author. So give me something in the author realm. What's the one thing in writing and being a writer that we aren't talking about but really should be?
Ooh, I would say, maybe this might sound, again, a little bit cliche for a Christian writer, but the importance of learning what's right and doing it. I feel like there's been a trend in books in recent years of, having these kind of morally gray or dark characters who do bad things, but then they're not repentant about them. And I personally love morally gray characters because it's relatable. It's interesting, but I want them to find redemption and hope and light at the end. I want to see characters learn what's right, and maybe it's really, really hard for them to do, but they do it anyway. I would love to see more of that in writing.
Agreed. I think that the idea of the anti-hero, of the morally gray character, has been played out just a little bit, and people need more hope when they leave the movie theater, when they put down a new book, when they listen to a new album. I personally love the story of the hero. I'm all about the hero's journey, and I love tales of courage and hope. And I have no problem with people having to go through terrible things and do terrible things to become that hero. But I think that we definitely need them, and we're in desperate need of that right now. And it is our calling as believers in Christ to be sharing joy. So I love that. I think you're right. Cool. Well, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this interview. And please go and check out Alexandra Wendt on Instagram. Make sure that you are subscribed and sharing the show. Share it with another author, friend, or somebody who would love to read this book. All the links for Alexandra are going to be in the show notes. Thank you guys. Stay courageous.